so much for welcoming me to talk about what I can honestly say is my favorite subject, the GAR. Now, today, what I plan to talk about is first, I'm going to talk about the GAR in general, but I'm not going to spend all that much time, and you just have to understand the big picture. The national GAR, the Massachusetts GAR, I'm going to talk about the state organization. I'm going to talk about the post system, the fact it was a department. The posts, of course, are the local organizations in each town and city. And I'm going to talk about what I wrote a great deal about, but it's very important to the entire organization, and that's the status of African Americans in the GAR in Massachusetts and in most of the GAR. I'm going to talk about all Black posts that were, as they would say, composed of African American, or what they would say, Black or colored comrades, and integrated posts. I'm going to talk, we'll talk a little bit about the 54th Massachusetts. Even it's partly their story, but it's also all sorts of units African Americans served in, including the Navy, which is always very much neglected. And I'm going to talk about how the fact that this acceptance was very key to how Union veterans, white and Black, remembered the Civil War, what they had fought for, a war for union and freedom was the end of slavery. Now, first, you may know that the Grand Army of the Republic was founded in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, 1866. It was a handful of Northern soldiers in Decatur, Illinois. Now, eventually it spread across the United States. In its early years, until, say, the early 1870s, it was a veterans organization, but fairly political and aligned with the Republican Party. Now, some say it was these politics that led to its demise. By the late 1870s, it really wasn't very large. In fact, it had disappeared in a number of states. But others actually say, and I'm kind of more on this, and I've read this, that there was a very unpopular ritual which made new people who were just joining, they call them recruits. And I can't think that that was very popular if you'd fought through an entire war. But in the 1880s, the GAR revives, and when it becomes less of a partisan organization, but still political, and I'll explain the difference, and more of a social and patriotic organization, its three principles were fraternity, charity, and loyalty. Now, it's not parochial in the sense that it would only support the Republican Party. It was about pensions. And if you supported pensions, you were fine. Eventually, they did get what people have called a service pension, but it's sort of a pension. If any veteran was unable to work or indigent, they could get a pension for their service without it being service related. They got that in 1890, and that was the height of the membership. 425,000 veterans belonged. This makes it by far the largest social and political cultural organization in the United States in that time period. Now, the Massachusetts GAR is just one department. That's what they call state level organizations. The GAR Massachusetts started with post number 1, the Rodman Post in New Bedford, in 1866, but it started when the entire group started. It never went away, even though places like Indiana, it completely disappeared. It stayed as a department through those turbulent years. Eventually, it had 200 posts. It did have membership losses. In 1873, it had about 11,000 members. By 1880, it had dropped to 8,000. And it was after that, there was the revival of the GAR in Massachusetts and just about everywhere else. It's a little hard to track the early Massachusetts GAR because in 1873, a fire destroyed the Massachusetts state records for the group, and actually the national records were there too. The Massachusetts GAR, though, was very history-oriented and a non-surprise, and it recreated their existence by recreating the early history of their organization, which is available at the Library of Congress. Now, GAR in general was pretty intensely involved, and it wanted to record its members' experiences, veterans' experience. It had things like war sketches, but not always were they retained by later generations. But there's still a fair amount running around. Now, the key, though, to the GAR, and this had been one of the things people were very focused on, was its racial composition. And it's a very strange story because people wrote a great deal about the GAR, and they were trying to say, well, look at the Union veterans. They didn't even like African Americans. And they said it was segregated. And one scholar who did a study on the GAR actually did a detailed study of a post in Brockton, Massachusetts. And it had a Black member. But for some reason, he just decided that was rare and that it wasn't anything that reflected well on the GAR. In fact, he said by 1880s, virtually all GAR posts were segregated. Well, that's not exactly what I found. What was really strange, and in the same paragraph, he described the life of Amos Weber, who had a weather diary that was very famous. And he actually had a 40-year membership in an integrated post in Massachusetts. So he has the book he's citing about this man's life that mentions he belongs to an integrated post. And he values it so much, he stays as a member for 4 decades, which is very unusual. Now, there are integrated posts, and I found those, and I'll go into detail, but most people recognized quite quickly that they were all Black posts. And that's the same in Massachusetts. There was one in Boston, and the Robert Bell Post, and one in New Bedford, the Robert Gould Shaw Post. What's interesting about all Black posts is everyone's like, oh, this shows that white people segregated Black veterans. But it's not exactly true. It's more like a Black church or a Black school. African Americans formed them, and as I studied them very closely, they did it for very important reasons. First, you have to understand that Black posts were chartered and created by Black veterans. You also have to look at the network and the community around them. One of the most important is the Women's Relief Corps. They also had sons of Union veterans and daughters of Union veterans. And they saw themselves, and I saw this, and I read this, as playing a role in the battle for Civil War memory, reminding Americans that Black Americans had fought in a war for their own freedom at white veterans' side. So all of this kind of put a different cast, so to speak, on Black posts. And I think we all know better than when I wrote the book initially, that it was a effort that still goes on today to promote more the lost cause view of the war. And Black veterans were very much, and so were white veterans, and I'll talk about that, against that idea. The idea the Confederate war effort was as worthy or more worthy than the Union war effort. The South was right. The war had nothing to do with slavery. Confederate soldiers were more gallant, oddly enough, because their pre-war society was more noble. Defeat was due to overwhelming numbers. It was just immigrants or hirelings that fought in the U.S. Army. No Massachusetts veteran would ever tolerate this, white or Black. It was an all-white brothers' war, and Black Americans were only faithful slaves because slavery was beneficial. I think if you watch the movie Gone with the Wind, you got the idea. Now, to understand how GAR veterans, white and Black, felt about this, it should be noted that the Boston-based GAR fought probably the worst cinematic presentation of the lost cause, the birth of a nation, with their last breath. They completely thought it was wrong to portray that. Now, we all know, and we get back to Massachusetts, because oddly enough, in this story, we always get back to Massachusetts. It was the story of the 54th Massachusetts in the movie Glory, which, and I can't even tell you how many students or others have told me, was the first inkling that Blacks had even served in the Civil War. That is one of the great lost cause victories. The GAR, because of its existence as an integrated organization, no one who lived in 1900 or 1809 or even 1910 didn't know that Blacks had served, because they were in their own posts, they were on parade, and they used their membership to remind people. After they were gone, there was no one to remind them. Now, glory, if you can tie to your state, of course, it's the 54th. The New Bedford Post was named for Robert Gould Shaw. In Pittsburgh, African Americans also named their post for Colonel Shaw. He was probably the most popular name. So when you understand that, you understand how important to all Black veterans, no matter what unit they served in, was your particular Massachusetts story. The Pittsburgh Black veterans explicitly wrote in their record that their post was to commemorate Shaw and his men. Now, Boston, though, they decided to be original. They had the Robert Bell Post, and that was the Black post in Boston. And it was named after an American hero, Fort Fisher, which, again, getting back to movies, and we do always get back to movies and Civil War memory, Lincoln had the Battle of Fort Fisher in it. Women were also involved, and that's another reason why I think Black membership, whether it be in a Black post or integrated GAR, African-American women were keenly involved with the GAR. The famous African-American nurse, Susie King Taylor, belonged to the Women's Relief Corps of the Robert Bell Post, and the Women's Relief Corps were very essential in patriotic exercises and providing relief and comfort to veterans. So actually, the Women's Relief Corps usually existed long after the post itself folded. There was a New Bedford group had a Ladies of the GAR, the Jane Jackson Circle, and they would have patriotic concerts. You have to see a Black GAR post as a very important community organization that was in this integrated group called the GAR that had its relationship with white posts. They were very close, that memorialized with white posts that were allowed to demonstrate that had a certain prominence in the community because they belonged to the GAR. I found it very difficult after that, and particularly when I monitored how closely Black and white posts would work together, to see it as some kind of racism, which was decidedly unpopular with some academics. Now, one of the reasons when people say segregated, we say, well, there are Black posts. You know that, don't you? I've gotten that. And I say, yes. But honestly, you have to, if you looked at it very carefully, there are many, many integrated posts. And even people who weren't integrated posts, they would meet together. Like, for example, the New York Age was a very prominent Black newspaper, and they reported that Commander Isaac S. Mullen of the Robert A. Bell Post 134 GAR, they always announced its number 2, was most agreeably surprised on Tuesday evening the 5th, while on a visit to the Benjamin Stoughton Post 68, located at Dorchester, with an order for a chandelier to be placed in the Bell Post Hall. The Stone Post welcomed Black and white members, and there's all of these, whether they commemorate Memorial Day or patriotic events, or they have parties and they dances together. It's not a separate world. Now, was there resistance to all of this racial harmony? Yes, there was. But we have to see this as the 19th century. There is no other organization that accepts the GAR, like accepts African Americans like the GAR. People always say, well, what about other organizations? I said, there aren't any, because many white organizations have a rule that they will not take Black members. In contrast, the GAR repeatedly and vociferously stated they would. Sometimes they failed in what they wanted to do, what they wanted to be, but they always fought for equality. So one time, it's interesting because people, when they write about the GAR, they find controversies when Black members were not admitted. And I found the same thing. I don't know if we have anyone who knows of William Dupree. He was actually very important. He was very involved in stopping Birth of a Nation in Boston. He was a very distinguished Black veteran. He was in the 55th Massachusetts. He actually was one of the handful of officers that Governor Andrew appointed at the end of the war. He eventually ended up supervising all mail operations in South Boston. Despite all of this, the Charles Stephenson Post 26 rejected him for membership. And this is what a Black newspaper said. The color phobia in the Charles Stephenson Post 26 and GAR and the GAR exists only in 5 or 6 men, since 70 took part in the balloting to admit Mr. Dupree, and 65 of this number were in favor of receiving him as a member. The newspaper wanted everyone who were outraged to remember that, quote, in censoring the Post for drawing the color line, that's what you said in the 19th century when you barred Black people, the Freeman continued, care should be exercised that every veteran of which it is composed is not harshly and severely condemned. The action of these 5 Negro haters unsparingly was denounced by all the GAR men who were present. Eventually, William Dupree ends up in another post, which always often happens. Now, a scholar would read this, and I have seen this enough, and say, look, even the GAR rejected Black members, and they wouldn't follow up and found out that William Dupree was eventually a member. Now, the key was you had to understand one thing. This is a blackball system. So if 70 people vote on a member, very early in the organization, you could only have one black ball for 20 members. 4 black balls would keep you out. I always find it astonishing that you would get that many Americans in the 1880s and 90s to agree to share their fellowship in what was, in their town or city, one of the most prominent social and political organizations. This is quite an honor. But what's interesting is, after examining Massachusetts GAR records, the quote color phobia in this post was fairly rare. Other posts would not accept African-American veterans, but most would. And again, you get back to not living in your own time and seeing what should be, but what these men overcame. But again, I always point out to people, the all-Black posts would reject people they didn't like or thought weren't suited. So there may have been another reason. But again, William Dupree, he ends up in a predominantly right post in Cambridge. He eventually, and this will be a story I'll talk about, commanded that post. His wife belonged to the Women's Relief Corps. So it was just a blip. And I often say that about the Massachusetts GAR. Rejecting Black members was just a blip that occurred when some men could not overcome their prejudices. And I actually, in the case of Massachusetts, I don't have this for all states, was able to find a fairly comprehensive list of all GAR members in your state at a certain point. And so I was able to go in and count how many Black members there are. Now, one of the things I have to tell you is that no one puts integrated next to the post name, and no one puts a C next to the veteran's name. So you have to find it out. I find mixed race organizations by noting that there is a private in the 5th United States Colored Troops in a post, and a captain who served in the 5th Ohio, or in the case of Massachusetts, a soldier who served in the 20th Maine or the 20th Massachusetts, and a soldier who served in the 54th as a private. So initially I had done this with death records in other states. And I did Massachusetts death records. And based on that, I thought, well, it looks like about half of all Black veterans who ever belonged to the GAR were in integrated posts. But when I received a list virtually all members of the GAR, which someone put on a CD. I have to find that. Sargent, a man named Dean Sargent, did. I went through it and I counted. It was old-fashioned history. I counted all the Black members and all the people who belonged to integrated posts. And about 60% of all Black veterans who was ever in the GAR in Massachusetts were in integrated posts. That is an astonishing number. The two exceptions are, of course, the Black posts. Now, the New Bedford Robert Gould Shaw post doesn't last as long because it's small, but even those men end up joining integrated posts. The Robert Bell post is a very important post with political clout. It's an important Boston social and political organization, and it is a centerpiece of the Black community. But most Black veterans belong there. Why did I emphasize this? A lot of it is going to be about what I'm going to talk to you at the end. I had set out only to talk about Black members of the GAR, and I learned a great deal about their white counterparts. And I got to this point where I refused to separate them, because I can guarantee you, if we went back in our time machine, there's no one in the Massachusetts GAR which would see them as separate. They would see, and they often stated, that Black posts were no different than a post composed of naval veterans or a post composed of cavalrymen. They did not see it as a racial line. Partly, I think the Massachusetts experience, which is rich in its racial acceptance of Black soldiers, had to do with the 54th, true. But if you look at battles, the Massachusetts regiments were often served with Black units. Now, everyone, whenever I tell this story, I say, well, there's the 54th, but you do know there's over 100 regiments of United States colored troops. And they too they were welcome in these units because not everyone served in the 54th. Now, what I found is an integrated a pattern that was best portrayed by Massachusetts, but also by Connecticut, your neighbors. Connecticut had no Black posts. It only had integrated posts. And I think it's because Connecticut soldiers were at Fort Wagner, they were at Lusty, they were at Port Hudson. They served in the Department of the South alongside Black soldiers, and some of their bloodiest battles were alongside Black soldiers. Lusty, the 7th Connecticut, served next to the 54th Massachusetts, the 8th U.S. Colored Troops, and the 35th U.S. Colored Troops. Now, I have to say, people often resist this. So they want to know, well, were Black veterans treated well? Were they accepted? So I found some examples from your Massachusetts posts or about Massachusetts veterans. Remember, we mentioned Amos Weber. He was in Worcester, Massachusetts, and had a number of Black veterans. They recorded that one of the largest audiences of the season gathered to listen to the stories of the colored veterans, given by comrades Hemingway, Phelps, Scott, and Wiggins of the 54th Massachusetts, Weber and Giles of the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry, and Waters of the U.S. Colored. Another post member, Charles Clark, belonged to the 26th USCT, and he shared with his comrades a vivid recollection of the attack on Fort Sumter. Now, he had been there as a slave. When they did a book highlighting the post members' experiences, they put a whole chapter in for the colored members. They would say colored. It was very much a compliment. I also looked, everyone said, well, they're treated badly. Black members in Massachusetts and elsewhere, and Massachusetts is a remarkable study, were accepted in high positions. One of the pictures I will show you or send to you is William Benjamin Gould, who commanded his post. He was a Black sailor. John Bond, another prominent Black veteran, was the junior vice commander of his post, a racially integrated post in Hyde Park. Often Black veterans were color bearers. The Washington Post reported on a parade at the GAR's national meeting in 1892 It described an integrated post from Haverhill, Massachusetts, as, quote, noted for several colored veterans in their rank, including color bearer Diggs and Walker. Now, this might merely seem as symbolic, but I am a military historian. Everyone knows the color bearer is considered an honor. It's considered an extraordinarily brave person in a Civil War unit. And I refuse any idea that it's just a token, because everyone knows about color bearers. Now, everyone says, well, why didn't anyone find this? And one of the reasons they found it is the GAR is relatively colorblind. For the 19th century, it's amazingly colorblind. All of the posts are listed in order. Posts are only informally referred to as colored or black. Mostly they use the colored term, oddly because it's not about race, it's they were colored troops officially. A post, if you want to find the Robert A. Bell post or the Robert Gould Shaw post, you might suspect the Robert Gould Shaw is, but they're just numbered and listed right after the other. All GAR posts are listed from 1 to 200 based on, there's no back of the bus there. They don't list, the muster rolls don't say color. You look for a private or a sergeant in what you know is an African-American unit. And you have to delete a very important person for our story, the white officers in their black units. Now, what I found most interesting, and I read a great deal of, was the state encampment record. This is where what would happen is at a state encampment is that they would have speeches about what the war meant. And the reason, and this was very important, initially I read them and I said, oh my God, not another speech, not another speech. But what I found out was constantly white GAR members talked about what was important to them in how they remembered the war. And they would frequently talk about that it was about slavery and that it was about Union. And people say, well, they were probably just adding that and they didn't mean it. No, they're very explicit and they're very clear. And in many encampments, they say that's why we accept Black members. Let's look at the Massachusetts state. And the first thing we have to talk about is the most extraordinary thing happened here. A Black veteran was the department commander. He was a junior vice commander. He was a senior vice commander, and eventually department commander James Wolfe. He was a very honored and prestigious man. He was a lawyer, and people say, well, he was an elite. No one who's not an elite isn't a department commander. You have to be very literate, well-spoken, and you have the money and the time to run a state organization. I actually almost missed him. He's a sailor, by the way. Sailors are hard to find. It'll say the USS something, Housatonic. And you won't know it unless you have a segregated unit. When he was elected, he thanked the other GAR members for recognizing true manhood. He said, let's forget color. And people always couldn't, but this seemed to indicate that it didn't matter as much. He often used his bully pulpit to fight what actually all his white comrades agreed with, the notion that we should reconcile with the South based on forgetting what the war was about and forgetting Black citizens. He advised his comrades against extending, quote, the hand of friendship and fraternity to those on the other side because of the hundreds of thousands of men of darker hue who in the South have no rights, loyal men who wore the blue. He demanded that Southerners respect American citizenship, regardless of religion, race, or color. And I can think of no bully pulpit that any African American would have had at the turn of the century that would match this. Now, you're saying, well, he's Black. Of course he cared. But what I found was white veterans cared very much about what the war meant. They were very aware of the lost cause and its attempt to rewrite history. And I found this extraordinarily, and it's in many GARs across the country in its debate over textbooks, because the United Daughters of the Confederacy loved to control textbooks. We still have these battles today. Massachusetts officials, and these are white officials, wanted textbooks to characterize quote, the attempt of the Southern slaveholders and their sympathizers to destroy the Union as, quote, treason and rebellion, and moreover, that it was a crime against humanity. Now, why would it be a crime against humanity? Because it was, quote, between the advancing civilization of the 19th century and the barbarism of the Middle Ages as represented by Negro slavery. And Union veterans particularly wanted school children to understand the war was about slavery. The war between, this is what they wanted to remember, the war between 1861 and 65 was a rebellion that had settled for all time that secession was treason and would not be permitted, that it destroyed slavery, that it showed the strength of the republic, that it proved that there was not air enough on the continent to float two different flags. They constantly said that both in Massachusetts and in other GARs. I call this language in my book the one cause, WON, as opposed to the lost cause. They constantly reiterate that it was the preservation of national unity and liberty, the end of slavery. A Massachusetts commander in 1915 looked back 50 years to what had been accomplished at Appomattox. Quote, the Union was restored, he explained, but not as it was. Human slavery, the foulest blot and greatest curse on our national life, has been forever removed. Another Massachusetts chaplain said on Memorial Day, comrades plant, quote, above their sleeping dead, the loved colors under which we marched together and the ensign of a country they died to save. The last foul stain upon the flag has been removed by the combined valor of the volunteer armies of which they were a part. Through their sacrifice, it's the flag of the free. Veterans talk about this regularly. It's the way they talk about the war. They do not separate Union and freedom. Another Massachusetts official. The trophies of the Union soldier are the Union saved, slavery abolished, the Constitution purified, and constitutional liberty preserved for the world. Everything that you contended for was completely and honorably obtained, and such will be the final verdict of impartial history. Now, eventually times pass and a new generation takes over and they forget a lot of this. I think the passing of the generation explains a lot of the resurgent Jim Crow and disenfranchisement of the late 19th and early 20th century. But I don't think, by then GAR men were very old. They didn't maybe defend civil rights as much as one would like, but they had won the freedom of African Americans. They had saved the Union. And they were old men who'd fought very hard campaigns for this. I think it was the failure of the next generation. James Wolfe, for example, eventually dies. And when that happens, they commented on him as they did because of his prominence. Ironically, it was 1913, the 50th anniversary of both Gettysburg and Fort Wagner. He was memorialized as, quote, a loyal comrade held in high esteem by all his comrades. And that could be said of the Massachusetts GAR and all of its men. But here's what I really want to emphasize. When I began my project, when you think about the Massachusetts GAR, people say, well, are you going to give a special talk on Black veterans? No, I'm not. Because the Massachusetts GAR would come and start pounding on my head, I think, because they didn't see it as separate. They didn't see the posts as separate. They didn't see their wars as separate. And I often found, I didn't find this exact remark because I think it was too obvious in Massachusetts. Often, white veterans would say, look at our comrades. That's what we fought for. And I think GAR men, because of their almost staggering refusal to accept a color line that was so common in the 19th century, embraced their Black veterans because it was central. It was central to what they had done in the Civil War. It reminded them what they had truly achieved, which was a united nation, but one of free men and women. Thank you.